Welcome to the FMCG Guys, the podcast that dives into the innovation, strategy, and trends shaping consumer goods and retail in Europe and beyond.
Welcome to the FMCG Guys podcast. I am your co-host, Daniel Torres. When I'm not hosting this podcast, I am the Director of Executive Search at Dwyer Partners, specialized in consumer goods and retail leadership executive search for the 21st century. So today I'm happy to be accompanied, surprise, by the great Efrain Rosario. Hey, Efrain, how are you?
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for the kind intro, as always.
Well, you don't deserve any less. After putting up with me for more than 2 years, I think that's the minimum I can say to you.
It's very kind. Thank you.
No problem. So we've done a lot of hot topics this year on the podcast. Like, I think that's some hot industry topics that we've been able to tackle, like revenue management, digitalization times 3. So quite a lot. Also, like the tensions between FMCG companies and the big customers. So I think it's about time that we speak about the topic that will occupy us today, which is supply chain, which we've covered in the past in other years, but I think it was long overdue that we looked at it again, right?
Yeah, absolutely, no doubt. It's one of those topics similar to revenue management and digitalization that even for people who don't specialize in this area, it's something that they're going to need to get increasingly familiar with. And if you think about what we went through in the pandemic in terms of like supply chain actually becoming more and more prevalent in the conversation in terms of like how business was going for certain brands, I think this is just a continuation of that.
Absolutely. So to review the state of affairs of supply chain, but also speak about supply chain transformation, which I think is a topic that was also long overdue that we went like a bit deep into it. We have an expert here who is Olivier Proust, who's the Senior Vice President of Supply Chain EMEA at Conair. Hey, Olivier, how are you doing?
Hey, guys, how are you? Daniel, how are you? Efrain, nice to meet you.
Likewise. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thanks for having me, for sure.
Where are you joining us from, actually?
I'm based in London, UK.
Excellent. Have you been there for long?
Yeah, I've been in London since 2013, so it would be just a little bit over 10 years now.
Excellent. So I know that you actually you're French, but you started your career in Canada. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I'm born and raised in France very shortly, right? Educated, I did an MBA in France, and then back in the early 90s, I went to Canada for a 6-month internship actually, and I stayed 20 years. So that's kind of how I ended up in North America. So starting my career really at the bottom of the ladder as a warehouse clerk, then shift supervisor. Eventually went to production planning, manufacturing, worked my way through all the demand planning and all of the function that cover the front line of the supply chain, including S&OP. Worked for various type of industries, but mainly, and all of them were within the FMCG and CPG industry. With about 15 years, more or less, within toys. 2 main companies work in toys. Stay in North America from about 94 to 2010. Moved to Central Europe in Slovakia for 3 years for a mission for a toy company, and then in the UK since 2013. That's basically my career path. Started, as I said, working in a warehouse. I worked probably all of the job in logistics as well as supply chain along my career at some point. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm fascinated to hear about your perspective of having worked across North American cultures in Canada and then transitioning back to Europe. I'm curious to get your perspective. Like, how were the working cultures there? Did you notice certain similarities or differences in terms of being based in those different countries?
Yeah, I mean it's very different, and you have to really. I mean, in the world of professional and working environment, you definitely have to adapt. I mean, the North America, being Canadian or US, even though there is a slight difference there, are different, but the main difference is with Europe, right? Like Europe tend to have a more formal and indirect type of communication approach, which is more steady with all the situation, whether you are in a fine environment or in a crisis mode. And I see that mainly with living in the UK, right? The approach is always formal and very indirect, where the US, as we know, is a more direct and informal approach, which sometimes has some benefits, sometimes could be a barrier to the communication. But that's where the main difference is for me. So when I moved to North America, I had to adapt to a more direct style. And when after I was molded after 20 years in the American style, I had to adapt back to the European style. So both of them have their challenge, but they are very different approach. I mean, you see that across. Even when you look at the political environment, for example, what's happening in the US, you do understand their communication style, which to some level, is kind of the same in the workplace. And Europe, I would say Europe is a little bit more diplomatic, more political sometimes, a little bit softer. Nevertheless, it's every problem gets tackled the way they should be tackled. But yeah, different type of environments.
But you didn't mention, Olivier, there's an essential difference between the US and Canada, which is saying about and saying about.
Yes, absolutely. And a lots of A in Canada.
Of course, that's the other one.
And I mean, I was to be honest, and to close the subject on this, one last thing is Canada is a bit different than America, because Canadians have a bit of both. They have the American kind of direct and honest style with a touch of softness and diplomacy within their approach. So it's kind of being in the middle, being in Canada. But yeah, Europe and North America are different, absolutely.
Yeah, I actually recently attended the Retail Media Summit in Canada, and I recorded some episodes there with different leaders, like from Walmart, Loblaws, who else? Hudson's Bay. So we'll be releasing that. So if the audience wants to know more about the Canadian market, soon to come.
Yeah. So I imagine that in a place like, for example, like Spin Master, which is where you actually, like, that move happened from Canada back to Europe, and some of the other companies that you've worked at as well, this flexibility that you've been able to build in terms of like adjusting your style has probably served you well, right? Because I'm assuming that you probably worked with teams that came from different cultures, even within Europe, and you may have even worked with people who were based in other parts of the world as well, I imagine.
Yeah, so Spin Master was really a turning point in my career as a company for two reasons. Because I started working, this was the first global company I worked for. So that had a footprint in North America, but also in Europe, and also a big footprint in Asia. And the second reason is because the responsibility I had there, even though I started as a North American director of demand planning, evolved to a more international position. So that's where I really learn how to open into the international market. So Spin Master was definitely where I kind of learned how to manage business environment within different culture, not only North America and Europe, but also now Asia. So that's where I really got the entire portfolio, I would say, of how to handle communication in a business environment with different culture, right? Spin Master is also the company where, when I started there, I was director of demand planning and responsible for implementing the sales and operation planning, which is a very important process, and we can talk about that later when we talk about transformation. But so my role evolved to demand planning director, to SNOP manager, and then Spin Master was growing organically very quickly within Europe. And at some point, they had put in place a head of sales and marketing all over Europe. So they opened division in Europe. However, the operation, which talking procurement, demand planning, forecasting, was all centralized in North America, which makes it very difficult to support the European market, which, as you know, has they have their specificity, which is very different than the North American market. So that was a big challenge. So to do that, the company decided to set up an operational hub in Europe just to support all of the growth in terms of revenue for Spin Master in Europe. And we set that up in Slovakia. So that's how I transitioned also from North America back to Europe by taking the leadership of managing the operational hub in Slovakia for Spin Master. So we opened an office that had customer service, forecasting, demand planning, S&OP, and logistic, and I was mainly focusing on managing Europe. So that's kind of how I transitioned back from North America back to Europe.
Tell us a bit about Conair and what you're currently doing there.
Yes, so my role at Conair is part of a bit of transformation of a mission of helping the company to move to the next direction. Conair is a North American company that has 3 major brands, and people might not know Conair in Europe, though it's very well known in the US. But in Europe, it would be more known as Babyliss Professional, and Cuisinart. So those are the 3 main brands that Conair has. They had other brands, of course, within the portfolio, but Babyliss is definitely the most well-known in Europe. So we have Babyliss Consumer, which is all the hair care products you can find in all of the retailers across Europe. We have Babyliss Professional, which is another line of hair care, but dedicated to professional market. And then we have kitchen appliances, small kitchen appliances, which is Cuisinart, where you can find from blender to toaster to sandwich maker and everything that fits within the kitchen. So my role as a senior vice president of supply chain EMEA is I'm responsible for the end-to-end supply chain and logistic of Europe, and I include UK within Europe. So what that means is my responsibilities start when the product leaves the vendor in Asia to when it's actually distributed either to the retail store or to the hand of the consumer. So that whole process falls under my responsibility. So I have teams in UK, France, supply chain procurement team, distribution planning team, and we have 2 distribution centers, one in the UK that manage the UK market, and we have one in France that is responsible for delivering product to all of the European countries. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that listening to you speak about your how your responsibilities have expanded in moving to this new role in Conair, and then prior to that at some of the other companies you've worked. The one thing that I see is possibly like connecting all these together is that for the most part they're all multinational but mid-sized businesses, and I was wondering if that's part of what if that's ever entered your thought process in regards to like looking for opportunities throughout your career.
Yeah, I've had opportunities in various organizations. First of all, I always wanted to stay in FMCG. I would say it's just a matter of taste for me. It's funny because when I'm asked what business would you prefer to work for, I don't really have a set business, but I know where I would not want to work for. I would not want to work for pharma, automotive, and food company. And that's the reason why I always stay within the mid-sized business, FMCG. And there is 2 main reasons for that. The first one is, I think it's where the growth is happening. When you have a big corporate that's usually settled, there is still a bit of growth, but most of it happens by acquisition when they have saturated all of the market in the world. There is not much places for them to go beside, growing by acquisition, where if you work in a mid-sized business, there are still lots of opportunities being, internationally or within their own region. So that for me has always been where the growth is, and a mid-sized company can still grow organically or also grow by acquisition, which is what we see at Conair right now. And it's beautiful because you still have so much potential for the company to grow. One of the other reasons is that because usually with growth, and we'll talk about that in a minute, come transition and transformation. A company has to evolve. So there is some transformation that needs to happen to be able to sustain the growth and to scale all of the back support of the company. So that's where, for me, that's where I kind of like to play. And finally, the last reason, it's more than two, but is usually those companies are much more flexible. Changes are happening much quicker. The decision-making process at the executive level is also much quicker. So it's more agile, more flexible. Where if you go to a corporate that's really well settled, where processes are already in place, it's more rigid. And for me, there is less space to move. And that's where I am. That's my sandbox. I like transformation. I like making changes. I like to scale operation for organization to be able to, to grow. So that's why mid-sized companies what have been targeted most of the time.
So this is the industry. What about the function? How do you envision supply chains strategic importance for companies? And has that strategic importance changed in the course of your career?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it has changed or if it was always like that, but it's definitely intensified. That's what I would say. And why I say that is because for me there is three pillars within the supply chain, right? And that's I cannot talk about marketing and any of these, but in the supply chain business, for me there is three pillars, and I've always driven my business based on those. The first one is cost to serve. The second one is customer satisfaction, and then I would say the third one, which we've seen more of it in the past 5 to 7 years, is speed to market, right? So cost to serve is how you optimize your supply chain, like your P&L. Again, we're talking about revenue management at the beginning a little bit before the podcast started. This is part of it, right? Customer satisfaction, you always have to be high rated. Today, in today's world, if you can't align the supply chain to have customer satisfaction, you're not gonna go too far, especially if you are an e-market company. And then finally, speed to market. We look at the rise of e-commerce over the past 5 to 7 years. Look at Amazon, what they can do today, where you can get your product almost delivered same day. If you don't have a speed to market strategy behind it, it's not you're gonna suffer, right? So that is what supply chain strategic pillars are for me, and you always have to try to evolve them, optimize them, and make sure you keep within customer satisfaction, control your cost, and then make sure that whatever you do, you do it fast. That's how it has evolved for me. Yeah.
So Olivier, you referenced, that you said that there's been some changes in the last 5 to 7 years. With regards to these three pillars, would you say that, how would you describe the current situation in terms of, has it changed dramatically? Or I guess specifically, what do you think has changed let's even think about it in the last 2 years per se, like after COVID?
Well, what I would say I would qualify that in two words, basically, where first of all, it became very unpredictable, right? If you look 5 years past, even back in the 90s, 2000, early 2000, and all of that decade, there was some level of unpredictability, but never as intensified as it is now. Everything became unpredictable since COVID. I mean, an example would be the price of containers, for example, to bring, freight forwarders and maritime company. We used to pay containers back in 2021 up to $16,000, $17,000. That was unprecedented before COVID, right? So that, and then the price fluctuation on bringing product over Europe from Asia has become very unpredictable, where before there was a little bit of fluctuation, but we could always predict what's happening. So the intensity of the unpredictability affecting the cost has been very high. And then the second thing for me is there's been a lots of factors such as geopolitical factors that have destabilized the supply chain. The most recent example that I can think about is what's happening with the Red Sea and how we had to, how we had to react extremely quickly to extended lead time for container to come here. I was talking to speed to market, when you go from 35 days from Asia to Europe through the Red Sea, and then you have to extend that to almost 50 days, and then you have congestion in port, and then you have increase of cost, and all of that happened in a matter of 3 weeks' time. This is for me what the major changes have happened, and also we've seen some geopolitical move with Asia. The Asian market is becoming more and more unstable. People are looking actually to source product somewhere else than in Asia. We've seen Vietnam, Bangladesh rising over the past 5-6 years. So those for me would be the two main words. We're gonna have to manage unpredictability and from time to time being destabilized. So how do you maneuver through this within the supply chain?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think probably the more external factors and unpredictability there is in the supply chain, the more companies will realize how key it is for them to do well, no? Ultimately. You talked about like how you like to do supply chain transformations. So how would you define a supply chain transformation, and why is it even necessary in the first place?
So it's an interesting topic for me because that's where I've been. That's what really drives me, and I fall into it by mistake almost. But here is what I've noticed. Right, I've noticed a pattern, and I mean, in today's world, people start recognizing, the rise of the supply chain importance and the operation has been recognized over the past decades. But if you look at it, most organizations out there, the two primary functions are sales and marketing. Because if you do not have sales and marketing, you do not have a company. That's basically it, right? You need to generate revenue to be able to have a sustainable business. So what has happened, and especially in the mid-sized world, corporate world, most of the companies have focused all of their effort within marketing and sales, right? And then they kind of got where they want with that. That means they have achieved the growth, they have achieved what they wanted to do, acquisition, penetration of new market. And then they come to a point where they are like, whoops, we are leaving revenue on the table simply because we haven't scaled the back end of our business, which is the logistic, the operation. We haven't scaled any of this. So we focus all of our investment and money into growing sales and growing our business. But operation, I would tend to say, is kind of more or less the last one to be looked at, yeah? So some companies, mainly the last three one I work in, and mainly the last one in the UK before Conair, they basically were leaving revenue on the table because operation was not scaled. They could not deliver on time. They could not, order preparation and delivery was not happening fast enough. When I was talking to speed to market earlier on, that's what's happening. We weren't able to kind of deliver the growth to the consumer. So they always need someone who can come and look at assess the whole operation and say, what do I need to do to actually scale it? And that's what transformation for me is like. So this could be very small projects such as implementing a sales and operation process to increase our forecast accuracy so we can buy the right product in the right volume, to consolidation of distribution center, to a construction and a building of a new DC, which is more automated, so we can get the order faster. So it can be anything from small project to big project, and that's what, for me, transformation is. And I've done a big one at Funko, where I basically built a brand new building for the UK for them. We moved from I think we moved from a little bit under 100,000 square foot building to over 400,000. And then that's what also I'm doing in Conair, a transformation where when the company was acquired, Conair was managed in a very silo way. The UK was independent of Europe. And there I'm looking at basically how can I do some synergy between all of those departments, from procurement to forecasting to warehousing, logistic, and everything. So that's what transformation is. And so it's basically optimizing and making sure we have a cost control and we can deliver some sort of ROI. Yeah.
So Olivier, kind of harkening back to the three strategic pillars that you mentioned earlier, in your role, as a senior leader at these companies, at these brands, how do you personally see the opportunity to really elevate the role of supply chain as being more strategic and making sure, like you said, you kind of avoid the situations where it's not thought of until it's too late and you have to kind of scramble to be able to catch up? Like, how do you see that role of supply chain being elevated to be more strategic?
So the first thing is that you have to make sure that supply chain has a seat within you can call it executive leadership team, senior leadership team, whatever you call. Supply chain operation must have a seat there. That means there must be someone, which in that case in Conair is myself, who would represent the supply chain and the operation and report on the impact that anything that sales marketing would do, what's the impact on the business is. So for example, we decide to put a new product on the market. Okay, not a problem. I'll say, do whatever you want, but make sure you optimize the packaging. Because if you can put six products in a master carton instead of 4, I'm gonna minimize my cost of containers. I'm gonna minimize my storage in the DC. So I'm gonna optimize my cost, right? You wanna launch a new product on the market? We have to be also careful at what is the launch date, because we have disruption on the Red Sea. Lead times are longer. So you're planning to launch on June 1st, I would, make the calculation and say, there is a risk there that we're gonna be late to market. If you wanna do all the promotion, investment and the advertising for launch on June 1st, there might be a risk. So that's how I see the supply chain coming in and having an importance on again, on the revenue of the company. Yeah, because everything that we do in supply chain and operation, actually most of the time is spending. We are not a revenue generating department, right? We are a cost center. Even though at Conair, we find some ways to kind of, generate revenue through logistic, but that's another story. Most of the companies are actually revenue spending. So how do you minimize that? But how do you also kind of give some warning sign to other departments of the impact it could have at the back end? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense?
And when you have all these like disruptions, all these events that are totally out of your control, as the head of supply chain, how do you manage that? And more specifically, how do you rally your teams to overcome these events?
So the first thing is for me is two things. The first thing is communication. So you have to when you have a crisis like the Red Sea, for example, where the Red Sea crisis was not only the lead time, but the fact that they closed the Suez Canal had an impact, of course, on lead time. So again, speed to market was affected, but the most important thing that was affected is the capacity of getting space on vessel, which became overbooked, and then the containers, also the equipment, which also became overbooked. So at one point, that has created a blockage, a bottleneck within the supply chain, where it was very difficult to get equipment to put the product in. And then when you got the equipment, you couldn't find space on the vessel. the first thing is you need to involve all of the parties within the organization that touch or have a task or function or responsibility within that crisis. So then you over communicate with those people, and then you involve them within the issue. You try to find solution together, and then you make a list. The second thing is, what I look at is what I can control and what I cannot control, because there is things that you can control still and things that you cannot control. So we make a list of what can we affect, what can we impact, and then we try to find the best solution. And the last thing is you always have to communicate to the business what the impact is going to be. This is what's very important, because you don't want anybody within sales, marketing. We have division all over Europe, so they are not locally close to us. So when there is an issue, you have to make sure that you communicate as soon as possible what the disruption is going to be, what can you do about it, what is the solution, and what the impact is going to be on the business. So at least everybody is aware of what the situation is, and we are working on it, and we're trying to find solutions. So always over communicate is the last thing is the best thing you can do. Yeah.
Absolutely. One thing I've loved about this conversation, Olivier, has been that, the clarity that you bring in terms of, like, you're very clear in regards to, like, what you think the success factors are for supply chain, both within the context of the broader business, but also in terms of, like, you as a senior leader. I'm curious to hear how you would then extend that in terms of, like, when you're building your teams and when you're looking for leaders that will work in your organization and supply chain. What is the criteria that you're using in terms of recruiting those leaders onto your teams?
So first of all, it's interesting you say that, because we've had to recruit a couple of people in Conair since I started there, and we use various type of recruiting agencies and stuff like that, and all of them says that they've rarely seen someone who is actually putting so much effort and detail within the job description. So first, for me, the first step is to find the best fit, because that's the end in mind, right? That's the goal. You have to find the best fit for purpose, is to make sure that, first of all, you got a very clear and refined job description about not only the technical skills that you want, but the function and the responsibility. So that's the first thing. Then the agencies or whatever you use for recruitment process will go to market, find that people. For me, when I come in, I do trust that, when they bring people in front of me, headhunter, recruiting agency would have assessed the skills and the technical skills and the experience. So I spend very little time in the interview to look for, to ask for it. So if you take an hour interview, I would spend maybe 15 minutes, no more, to kind of ask questions to make sure that that person, from a technical standpoint, is fit for purpose. The most important thing for me, and I've seen this before, it has to be a culture fit, and the profile, the behavior of the candidate has to be right. I've had multiple experience in my past where I would hire MBAs, which would be 10 times more intelligent than anybody else in the business in terms of technical skill, expertise within analytics and data and all of that. But the behavior and the culture fit was completely the opposite of the company's values. That, for me, is the most important thing. So this is the criteria that I will spend a lot of my time looking for when I'm recruiting a leader, right? If you need an analytical admin clerk type of job, this is a different story. But if you're talking about leader and senior leadership, for me, I would put behavior, profile, and culture fit on top, yeah?
Yeah, also because ultimately it's not only about you deciding to hire someone, but it's also about that person deciding to join you, right? So
Exactly.
They need to see like a transparency around the culture. It doesn't need to. It's not about good or bad culture. It just needs to be clear and transparent, right?
Yeah, and that person will have to work with all of the other person in the company too, right? So that's why it's also important. No, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah, and Olivier, going back to the beginning of your career, if knowing everything that you've learned till now, which I imagine is quite a lot, what's the one and only one piece of advice you would give to your younger self?
Always be curious about things. Always ask question and be curious. That's what drove me to where I am. In 1 minute time, I started to work as a clerk in a warehouse. I got interested about how things were planned to come my way. So then I started to be curious, and then I moved to demand planning. Then I heard about SNOP. What is an SNOP? How does that work? What does it do to the company? I got curious, and then I moved there. So always, for me, it's always be curious about things and explore. Yeah.
No, this is great advice. Also, curiosity is what drives us to do this podcast, Olivier. So we're big fans of curiosity. Thanks a lot, Olivier. This was fantastic. So Efrain and I will now take out some conclusions from this conversation. Efrain, what are your key takeaways?
I mean, there's been so many. Like I said, one of the things I've really appreciated about this conversation with you, Olivier, has been just the clarity that you bring to, particularly for somebody like me who works in marketing, who doesn't work in supply chain on a day-to-day, day in, day out basis. But I go back to the 3 pillars of supply chain strategy. For me, I mean, you know, if you're talking to somebody like me or somebody else in marketing, you're trying to indoctrinate them into the world of supply chain. I think starting there in terms of like, look, you need to think about cost to serve, customer satisfaction, and speed to market, and then, you know, drive from that in terms of what we do. I think that's a great starting point for any non-supply chain leader to really get their hands around something that may not be new to them.
Yeah, I also think it's interesting to know, like, the supply chain, the state of affairs, that is really like unpredictable. And we mentioned also it's unpredictable for many things, but a big component right now are geopolitical factors, like you have the tensions in the Red Sea, for example, and so on. So in order to address that internally, both with stakeholders, but also with the team, it's Olivier's style about over-communicating and always be a bit of what we were saying about being transparent. I think that was a good lesson to learn.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that anybody, regardless of whether they're in supply chain or any other part or any other function of the business, should take away from this, right? Which is like communicate early. And when you come and communicate, you know, give solutions, not just restate the problem. I think that's a good learning for all of us.
Yeah, no kidding. And actually, more at the beginning of the conversation, this is a thing that I thought was very interesting. And interestingly, we hadn't really gone into it in the podcast, which is this mid-sized company space, more in like from $500 million to $3 billion approximately. What advantages or what differences it has with big corporates? So according to Olivier, there's more growth in these, and normally more than in large businesses. Which, yeah, I totally agree with. And they normally need and require a transition and transformation mission, which is Olivier's specialty. So I thought that was interesting. And lastly, there's more flexibility as well, which I would add to that. There's also a bigger component of personal relationships. So to manage well, to have a good relationship with those like 2, 3, 5 stakeholders that will really determine if you'll do well or not. But I think that goes a lot into the culture fit that we were talking about, right?
Exactly. I was just going to say, I think then that ties into what we talked at the very end, which is how you think then about bringing people into the company and like making sure that, you know, again, you trust your agency partners to really vet candidates based on their skills and experiences, and then really focusing on more of that culture fit and alignment with your values as a company, and how important that's going to be, particularly in a place that's more of a mid-size, highly accelerated, transformative type of setting, like what Olivier has described.
Yeah, exactly. So, Olivier, I hope we summed up your points nicely.
Yeah, great. Fantastic. I really enjoy that. I wanted to thank you both for having me on this podcast. If you have anything in the future, I'll be more than happy to jump on another one for any kind of topic. So again, thank you very much to both of you for having me on this podcast.
Well, thank you. I mean, like I said, this has been very educational for a marketer like me. So I appreciate your time and schooling me on the world of supply chain, even if it's an introductory level. So we'll have to do a 201 version next.
We'll take you on that, Olivier. Don't worry. Now it's been recorded. Well, thanks, Olivier, and thanks to all our audience for tuning again. Thanks to our 12,000 plus LinkedIn followers now. We're also growing an Instagram audience, so feel free to follow us there. If you've enjoyed the podcast, subscribe, leave a review. You know the drill. And we'll see you in the next episode of the FMCG Guys. Have a great day.